The last president to be assassinated while in office, John Fitzgerald Kennedy had countless triumphs during his presidency, with his superb executive command during the space race, Cuban Missile Crisis, and the Civil Rights Movement. Although he also had the ultimate tragedy, his assassination while being president. He is an essential part of history and will go down as a great president. In the year 1961, two of the world's global superpowers have been thrust into a race, a space race. The United States had been losing this race for a while, and the new president wanted to change that. President Kennedy wanted to come out ahead and knew exactly how to do it. On May 25, 1961, John F. Kennedy declared to the world,
"I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth."
In 1957, the Soviet Union launched the first satellite into orbit.
Today, a new moon is in the sky, a 23-inch metal sphere placed in orbit by a Russian rocket.
In the face of a Soviet victory, the United States decided it wasn't going to stand by while their communist rival pushed ahead. But during the next 4 years, the United States only managed to select people to be in the new space program. This made it even worse when, in 1961, the Soviets launched the first manned rocket into orbit. Deciding enough was enough, the new president decided he was going to win this race. On May 25, 1961, President Kennedy announced his urgent national needs to the world, which included an extra $7 to $9 billion for the space program. America first attempted to launch a man into orbit, an ambition that became a success when John Glenn Jr. became the first American to orbit the Earth on February 20, 1962. This success inspired America and gave citizens a greater desire to reach the moon. This desire endured throughout the 60s for the new Apollo project. October 1962. Photographs of nuclear missile sites being constructed on the island of Cuba are taken by an American U-2 spy plane. Although these missile sites posed a massive security risk, President Kennedy decides these photographs going public would not only cause mass hysteria, but also alert the Soviet Union to the United States' knowledge of the construction. To decide what to do about the missiles, President Kennedy met in secret with his advisors for several long days. After these meetings, Kennedy decided to place a naval blockade around Cuba to bring the construction of the missile sites to a halt. On October 22, 1962, the public learned of the crisis. In a televised speech, President Kennedy alerted the world of the nuclear bases placed in Cuba, and also warned Cuba and the Soviets that if any missiles were launched from the sites, America would be forced to retaliate.
In the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island.
The Soviets replied that the missile sites were solely to defend Cuba against the attack of an aggressor. 5 days later, the standoff between the United States and the Soviet Union had not shown any signs of ending, and because of this, that night, Kennedy considered an invasion of Cuba, and he would have gone through with the attack if it wasn't for the offer made by the Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev. They offered to dismantle the sites if the blockade was lifted, and the United States promised not to invade Cuba. But the next day, Khrushchev further demands that the missile sites America built in Turkey be dismantled. Feeling that war is imminent, Kennedy offers to meet all of Khrushchev's demands. The confrontation that seemed to go on forever ended at 13 days long on October 28, 1962. It was this instance that brought us the closest to a nuclear war, and that was enough of a threat to make a change. On June 10, 1963, President Kennedy announced that America was going to begin high-level arms negotiations with the Soviets. On July 13, 1963, the two global superpowers started negotiations, and just 12 days later, they ended. After these relatively short 12 days, the Americans and the Soviets came to an agreement. On August 5, 1963, in Moscow, the Limited Nuclear Test Ban Treaty was signed. It prohibited nuclear weapons tests or other nuclear explosions underwater, in the atmosphere, or in outer space, and brought us one step closer to peace.
A great change is at hand.
President Kennedy made major changes during his presidency by embracing the civil rights movement. While Kennedy's involvement in the movement was distant, he was still active in the movement by initiating a movement with the private sector to shut down the economy for 90 days when 300,000 black people and some whites didn't buy anything besides food and medicine. He also mobilized the National Guard to protect 2 colored students being integrated into the University of Alabama. Although, he still was hesitant to enact a bill he created to end segregation because of opposition from Congress and growing controversy. Even though he initiated the civil rights movement, he did not see it through to the end of the segregation. Yet, it has been said that his involvement in the civil rights movement may have been the cause of his assassination.
If an American, because his skin is dark, cannot eat lunch in a restaurant open to the public, if he cannot send his children to the best public school available, if he cannot vote for the public officials who represent him, then who among us would be content to have the color of his skin changed and stand in his place? Who among us would then be content with the counsels of patience and delay? I shall ask.
Several shots were fired as President Kennedy's motorcade passed through downtown Dallas. The crowd
November 22nd, 1963. The world received a heavy loss that day. The world lost John F. Kennedy. The line "Kennedy is killed" was plastered on every newspaper in America. The riot had begun innocently enough. Kennedy was campaigning for his re-election on that day.
My fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country.
Kennedy had been on his 10-mile drive to the Dallas courthouse when the incident occurred. As the cars had been driving by, 3 shots were fired from the Texas School Book Depository building at 12:30 p.m., striking President Kennedy and Governor Colony. The 2 were immediately escorted to Parkland Hospital.
The sound of the muffled drums sweeps in melancholy waves over the hushed throng, a hush broken only by a stifled sob, a murmured prayer. A whole people is lifted up in common sorrow and ennobled in their hearts. And John celebrates his 3rd birthday with a soldier's farewell to his father. And the precious banner that was the president's shroud for 3 days is folded smartly for presentation to Mrs. Kennedy. An eternal flame is lighted before the grave by Mrs. Kennedy, the first such memorial to burn in Arlington Cemetery. She is followed by the president's brothers, Robert and Edward. And may the soul of John Fitzgerald Kennedy rest in peace.
A man may die, nations may rise and fall, but an idea lives on.